So thank you everyone. It's a great honor to be here. Today I'm going to speak about history and economic development, and hopefully I'll convince you by the end that I think it's useful to look at our past in order to understand current development, current global inequality, and to move forward thinking about the future. And I'm going to talk about 15 years of research that I've been doing and others in the field have been doing, and I really think this is an emerging body of evidence that is being developed within economics. So the starting point is thinking about global inequality. Okay, so this figure here is one way to represent global inequality. It shows you average income levels of all people across the world. The x-axis tells you the cumulative share of global population that are at a particular level of income. So the first thing to notice is that there are huge differences between the poorest countries and the richest countries. So if you take the poorest country and the richest country, you'll see that the richest country is 200 times richer than the poorest country. If you look at the bottom 5%, the top 5%, the difference is about 40 times. So there are huge differences. As well, you can see that the distribution is very skewed. So there's a very large number of individuals that live in countries that are relatively poor and below the poverty line. So within economics, basically the view is, once you start thinking about this question, why does the distribution of world income look like this? It's really hard to think about anything else. Okay? And this is really what my research has been focused on. So the one insight, or one thing I want you to think about, or I want to point out, is that if we want to understand the current distribution of global income, or current inequality, well, all we have to do is look back in time. So we see, this figure here shows average per capita GDP for different regions around the world. Okay, so if you can see that the relative ordering of regional per capita incomes today are similar to 50 years ago, or similar to 100 years ago. But if you go back to 1500 AD, really you don't see large differences. You don't see 40-fold differences in per capita income. So all of the divergence, all of the income inequality that we see in the world has happened since about 1500. So what happened in 1500? Well, 1492, Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas. 1488, the Portuguese sailed down the coast of Africa and round the Cape. And very quickly after these discoveries, a triangular trade is established. And so this is a trade between Europe and Africa and the Americas. And basically Europe ships manufactured goods like textiles to Africa. What does Africa ship to the Americas? Well, they actually ship human beings. They ship slaves. Okay? The slaves are then used in the Americas on plantations, sugar plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco plantations, and those goods are then shipped to Europe, and that's the three-corner trade. Okay? So all of the emergence of global inequality has occurred since the establishment of this trade. Okay? So coincidence, maybe, and I think a lot of the research that has been done recently has been trying to establish, does this have a causal effect on the divergence of income that you see from this time? Okay? So here's one piece of research. This is a figure taken from a paper by Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson. And what it shows you is our best estimate of per capita GDP, which is urbanization, for different regions of the world, for Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Asia. And it shows this from 1300 to 1850. Okay? And what you see here is that Western Europe, after about 1500, starts to diverge, starts to become a lot richer than the other regions, than Asia or Eastern Europe. So if you zoom in and look at Western Europe in particular, and this figure does this, you can break Western European countries down into two groups. So those that were engaged in the Atlantic trade, the three-corner trade that I just showed you, and those that were not. Okay? So from this figure, you can see that the increase in urbanization occurs primarily amongst the Atlantic traders. Okay? So in other words, the rise of Western Europe after 1500 is really the rise of countries that were engaged in this three-corner trade. Okay? So that's one piece of evidence about the rise of Europe and how it benefited from this historical event. So what's the second part of the three-corner trade? Well, this is Africa's slave trade. Okay? So here, between 1500 and 1900, Africa exported about 20 million slaves from the continent to the Americas, but also the Middle East, North Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Okay? So this was a huge event, and one particular characteristic of this event is that it was Africans enslaving other Africans. It wasn't Europeans enslaving Africans, it was Africans enslaving each other, selling them to Europeans, and then Europeans shipping them to the Americas. Okay? So when I began graduate school, I started thinking about this, and of course the question naturally arises, does the fact that Africa is the poorest country in the world, does that have, poorest continent in the world, does that have any relation to the fact that it experienced the slave trade? So does the slave trade explain Africa's relative underdevelopment? So the strategy I took was to collect information on the extent to which different parts of Africa were impacted by the slave trade, and if it's true that the slave trade had this impact on Africa, we should see that the places where the slave trade occurred the most, that those places are the poorest today. Okay? So this took me a number of years, and I had to basically go to primary sources, secondary sources, archives. This image here is a book from an archive in Tanzania. And from these types of records, you actually get information on the ethnic identity of slaves that were taken from Africa. So the second column to the right, you can see it says tribe. This reports the tribe of the slaves in this slave inventory. Okay? So from this, you have a pretty good sense of where did the slaves come from? Where were they captured? Where was the violence occurring? And from this, you can get an estimate of the number of slaves that were taken from each country within Africa. Okay? So if one constructs those estimates and looks at the data, you find a relationship like this. Okay? So there's a clear negative relationship. On the horizontal axis is the number of slaves taken, normalized by land area. On the vertical axis, you have a measure of GDP per capita, or prosperity today. So you kind of see this, you see this clear relationship. Those countries that had the most slaves taken are also the countries that are the poorest today. Okay? And this holds if you control for other things like colonial rule, endowments of natural resources, geographic factors, etc. Okay, so this is some evidence that this historic event, even though it ended 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, shaped income inequality within Africa today. So what's the third part of the triangular trade? Well, this is plantation slavery in the Americas. So this is an image of slaves working on a sugarcane plantation within the Americas. And again, one can undertake a similar statistical analysis and see, is it the case that slavery was bad for development? Within the Americas, North and South America, is it true that places that used more slave labor are more underdeveloped today? So this is the data. So this, on the horizontal axis, is the number of slaves, the fraction of slaves in the total population. On the vertical axis, again, is per capita income. So again, you see a very strong negative relationship where those parts, those countries of the Americas that specialized in slavery, in slave labor, plantation agriculture, those areas are less developed today. Okay? And so historians have studied this. The dominant hypothesis, although this is still being researched, is that slavery resulted in economic inequality, very severe economic inequality, which led to political inequality, and which led to bad institutions and institutions that aren't inclusive and are not good for long-term development. Okay? So taken as a whole, this body of evidence seems to indicate that a huge proportion of the relative inequality we see today is determined by these particular historical events. And this is just one historical event, the three-corner trade. There's a lot of other research that's been going on trying to examine and quantify the impacts of other historical events as well. So let me just contrast this view, which is the view that history and an evolutionary perspective really informs us and explains why the world is the way it is today. So another perspective is very different. And so this perspective is basically, would be something like this. I really don't need to understand history. If I want to understand whether a country develops, all I need to do is look at whether there's capital investment. So is there capital? Are there investments in machines? The health of the citizens, the education of the citizens, and then the quality of the policies that are implemented, right? This has nothing to do with history. All I need is data about today, and I'll understand fully development. Okay, so let's look at this argument. So this is from a recent paper by Kevin Greer and Robin Greer in 2007. And on the left figure, what you see is a relationship that shows you a statistic over time. So what they do is, for 1 year, take the level of real per capita GDP in every country, and then calculate a statistic called the standard deviation. So that's the dispersion of real per capita GDP across countries. And in other words, it's the gap or the difference between the rich and the poor. So calculate this for every year between 1960 and 2000. Okay, so the graph shows you this. And so what you see in the left figure is this has been increasing. In other words, the gap between the rich and the poor has been increasing. The rich are getting rich and the poor are staying poor. So in the second figure, you do the exact same thing, but look at capital investment. Okay? And what you see is the exact opposite. Over time, the poor are becoming more similar to the rich. Poor countries are investing in machineries, they're investing in other forms of capital, and they're becoming more similar to the rich countries. Okay? You can do the same thing and look at schooling. Poor countries are catching up to rich countries in terms of schooling, both primary schooling and secondary schooling. And even if you look at policies, poor countries are adopting the policies of rich countries. Okay? So basically what you're seeing is over the past 50 years, development economists have thought that these are the keys to growth: human capital investment, physical capital investment, good policies. And we've tried to promote an environment that facilitates developing countries adopting those policies, and they have. A lot of development has gone in to increasing education, increasing investments. But that hasn't translated into faster growth. Okay? So these, in some sense, what we've done is we've fixed the symptoms, and we really haven't fixed the cure of development. Okay? So that's led a number of researchers to think about, well, what are the real fundamental determinants of development? If there's low education, well, there must be a reason. And they've started to think about slow-moving factors like domestic institutions, social norms, cultural traits. Okay, so these are things that are deeper determinants, they're more fundamental, and they probably affect income and also affect capital education. So I would argue that even if these are the drivers of long-term development, one still needs to understand history. So to see this, consider the following paper. This is a paper by Joseph Henrich and co-authors published in the American Economic Review in 2005. And he wanted to measure cultural differences around the world. So he picked 15 very small-scale societies. So these are the societies here. And what he did is he played a specific game or a very specific experiment in these different societies. So this experiment is called the ultimatum game. It's very famous within economics. And basically what's happening here is there's two individuals, two players, that are dividing an amount of money. In the example shown here, it's $10. Okay? And this money is divided in a very specific way. First, player one proposes a division, proposes an amount for player two to get and an amount for himself to keep. And after this, player two observes this, and player two can choose to either accept the division or to reject the division. If player two accepts the proposed division, then each player gets the amount proposed. If player two chooses to reject the division, then they both get 0. Okay? And so the other important point is this is played once and it's anonymous. Okay? So the players don't see each other, they'll never know who each other is. So you can think about what would you do if you're player one in particular. This has been played in many, many places in America and Western Europe, and what you find is people typically offer for the other player to have 50%. In other words, in this case, where it's $10 for the other player to have $5, and I'll keep $5. When he played this around the world, you actually saw a huge amount of variation. Okay, so in this figure, every row is one small-scale society. The size of the dots tells you the frequency of that offer. So on the x-axis, it's the amount that player one offers to give the other player. And the bar, the gray bar, tells you the average for that society. Okay? So you can see that 50% is the most common. And for all societies except one, the average is less than 50%. In other words, people say, I'll give you a fair amount, but I'll only give you less than half, right? And so they keep more than half for themselves. This is true for every society except for one. You see the society at the very top? It's a society called the Lamalera. So this is a whale hunting village in Indonesia. So one might think, why do they have such different culture? You know, we kind of think of this as measuring cooperation or pro-social norms. Why is it that they're so cooperative? So if you actually look at how the Lamalera live, so the Lamalera are actually whale hunters. They traditionally hunt whales. It's pretty amazing actually, with sailboats and these giant bamboo spears. So the whole community gets together and then hunts whales, and after they kill a whale, then they share the meat, or they share the food with the whole community. So you can see that living this way requires a huge amount of cooperation. Okay? And so in this environment where production is occurring like this for thousands and thousands of years, one would expect that norms of cooperation and sharing would develop, and that explains why the Lamalera are so cooperative and so giving in these games. So in other words, if we want to understand cultural differences around the world today, we really need to understand the evolutionary environment and the history that developed those cultural norms. So let me give you two more examples. So this example is again returning to Africa, thinking about the slave trade. And this is research I've done with Leonard Wanchikon, who's a professor at Princeton. And we started looking into how slaves were taken. And here's a table that tells you for 144 individuals for which we have data, exactly how were they enslaved. So the second to bottom line is kind of what really amazed us. 20% of these slaves, former slaves that were interviewed, they were interviewed in the 19th century, said they were sold or tricked into slavery by a relative or a friend. So in other words, a family member, someone they trusted, had tricked them and sold them into slavery. Okay? So remember, the slave trade is going on from 1500 to 1900. It's an environment where you can't trust anybody because they'll sell you into slavery. And so one would expect that culture would evolve in this environment. In particular, a culture of distrust. You would start to not trust those around you. So we wanted to test this hypothesis. So what we did is return to the data that I collected. And remember, we had data on the ethnicity of slaves that were taken. And this map shows you, visualizes this data. So it shows 850 ethnic groups in Africa, and it provides a visualization of how many slaves were taken from each ethnic group. So what you can do is connect this to household survey data, which exists pretty much for the whole continent, and compare this to people's self-reported trust in others, self-reported trust in their family, their friends, etc. And what you find, I won't show you the details of the statistics, but you find those ethnic groups or those areas that are the darker shade for which more slaves are taken, those groups are significantly less trusting today. Okay? So one final example, right? And so again, this shows you how history and historical shocks affect culture. Another big cultural difference around the world is attitudes about women. Is it okay for women to work outside the home, or is it better if they stay within the home? Lots of societies believe if a woman works, then the children will suffer. You won't raise as good of children. And actually, this is observed in female labor force participation rates around the world. And if you zoom in to the most extremes, you see there are huge differences in female labor force participation rates, huge differences in whether women work in the labor force or not. So where do these differences come from? So this is other research that I've undertaken, and it turns out that these differences can be explained to a large extent by what type of agriculture was practiced traditionally. Okay? So there's two types of agriculture. One is intensive plow cultivation, which is this example here, where a plow is used to turn the soil, and this requires a lot of upper body strength to keep the plow in the soil and to control the animal that's pulling it, or to pull it yourself. Okay? And then, incidentally, this is a picture from South Korea from the 1950s. And what's the other form of agriculture? Well, it's hoe agriculture, often called swidden agriculture or slash and burn agriculture. Here you don't use a plow, and instead you use a hoe. Okay? And The difference is the plow requires a lot of upper body strength. The hoe moves soil, but much, much more slowly. And as you can see here, the hoe is much more compatible with childcare. So what you see in societies that use the plow, men were the ones that worked in the fields and women stayed in the home. In societies that used the hoe, there wasn't this gender division of labor. Both left the home to work. And so over time, the views, or the cultural views, certain cultural views evolved. And in plow societies, the view was it's natural for men to work outside the home and for women to stay within the home. So if you actually take this to the data, so combine ethnographic data with existing data, you find a relationship like this. On the x-axis is basically a measure of the fraction of a country's ancestors that engaged in plow agriculture. And on the y-axis, you see female labor force participation. So those societies that traditionally were engaged in plow agriculture now are the societies where women don't work. Even though the society is no longer in agriculture, those cultural values still persist. You see this even if you look at firm ownership. So this is the share of firms that are owned by women. You still see a very similar relationship. If you look at political participation in politics by women, you see the same relationship. Even the sex ratio at birth, the male to female sex ratio, you see this. Okay? So again, this history, and in particular what type of agricultural technology used, was critical in shaping cultural norms, cultural values today. So the last view that I want to talk about is, well, somebody could have a view that economic development is solely determined by geography, okay? And so geography is the only thing that affects economic development. This would be the attitude of economists like Jeffrey Sachs, for example. And this is a tempting conclusion to come to. If you look at a map of the world, what you see is the poorest countries in the world happen to be in the tropics. So these are countries that are disease-ridden, soil is poor quality, and there's a lot of other detrimental characteristics that come with being in the tropics, okay? So if that's true, one could say, I don't need to know anything about history. All I need to know is the geography, and that will tell me about development today, okay? So I would say that even in this case, history is important. So let me give you one example. So this is, within Africa, there's a fly called the tsetse fly. The fly transmits a disease called trypanosomiasis. So I had a student who was a medical doctor that wanted to study this. So she started researching trypanosomiasis. She quickly realized that actually the biggest impacts of the tsetse fly and trypanosomiasis were historical. Okay? So what the fly does is it's makes humans sick, but it's actually lethal to animals like horses and cattle. So historically, these parts of Africa in shaded red did not have horses, did not have cattle. They could not engage in intensive cultivation. They could not engage in long distance trade, and they could not engage, as a result, in state formation. And when you bring these geographic characteristics and compare them with ethnographic data, you see exactly this, okay? So the different categories shown are areas which are the least suitable for the fly, starting on the left, 0 to 25%, all the way to areas or ethnic groups that are the most suitable for the fly or suffer most from trypanosomiasis. So you see all of these characteristics, the domestication of animals, intensive cultivation, plow use, political centralization, these are all pre-colonial, right? All of these characteristics you can see are correlated with the tsetse fly. So the very last thing I want to show you before I wrap up is one more example. So returning back to the slave trade, one thing that you observe in the historical record is obviously people did not want to be enslaved, so they did things to try and protect themselves from slavery. So one of the things that they did, which was common, was they would build villages at the base of cliffs. So this is a Dogon Village in Mali. And so here they built the village at the base of the cliff. That way when the slave raiders came, right, and they would come in this area on horseback, then they could run up the cliff. Okay, and they would hide up here, they would have food up there, and they could protect themselves. So you can see how this would be a beneficial strategy. The slave raider would have to climb up the cliff, grab the person, and then climb down while the person was probably kicking and screaming. And so, that's going to be very, very, very difficult. So these groups, the Dogon, basically moved their villages in the 16th century to the Bandiagara escarpment, which is an escarpment or a cliff that's 150 kilometers wide and half a kilometer high. So here's a picture further back, and you can see the defensive fortifications that are built in the cliff. And then even further back, you can see the defensive fortifications. So typically, development economists think that rugged terrain, uneven terrain, is not good for development. It's hard to build on uneven terrain. It's hard to trade, or more costly to trade. And it's also, agriculture is much more difficult. You need to terrace agriculture and flatten the terrain. So in general, around the world, what you see is a negative relationship between ruggedness. So this is all of the world, except for Africa. And you see the more rugged or the more uneven countries are the poorest countries. So, but within Africa, you see something very different. So this is Africa. So you see a positive relationship. So why is that? Well, that's because rugged areas allowed societies to escape from the slave trade, and the slave trade was bad. So in other words, rugged areas are richer today. So if you ignore history and just look at relationships between geography and economic outcomes today, you're going to miss the fact that the effects of geography depend crucially on the history of a particular area.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Okay, so this is the last example. And so the one takeaway point is we really cannot understand economic development today without thinking about history and how we got here. I think what's important now is how do we move forward? How do these insights from history help us move forward, design optimal policies? And that's a question I'll leave for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The World Knowledge Forum